Welcome back to America's Commercial Real Estate Show. I'm Michael Bull. My guest is Casey Conway, economist with CCIM, and we're doing the show today with a live audience from REGA Real Estate Group Atlanta. This segment is brought to you by Vista Property Report. Look, site selection and marketing commercial properties has now changed. With this product, you can pull 10 unique insights for any property, and guess what you're using? The power of smart loan location data. You can sign up now and you can get 10 free reports. Just go to vistapropertyreport.com. Well, like I said, we're continuing our Corona coverage of what's going on, where are we, how are participants dealing with it, and what should we expect moving forward. In KC, we've had some great stimulus, as you mentioned in the previous segment, from the government, and with the PPP and all that sort of thing, and it's probably helped a lot of our tenants with unemployment and things pay the rent. Taking retail out for a moment and maybe looking at apartments, industrial, and office, which it seems like they've had really strong rent collections so far, at least the most of the clients I've talked to. What do you expect moving forward for the next 3 months or so for rent collections with what you see going on?
Yeah, no, great question. So let's start with the really, really good news, industrial. So I'm on a board for a public REIT, and we collected 100% of our rent in March, 96% in April. And when we did our earnings release the 4th or 5th of May, we'd already collected 93% of May's rent. Those numbers finished out all over 95%. We've averaged 95% plus rent collection and occupancy for 5 straight years. We have good tenants like a FedEx or an Amazon, so we haven't seen any problem. We're a smaller REIT. I looked at Prologis. Prologis said, "Look at guys, we're collecting 93, 95% of our rent within the first week of the month that they reported, which was normal." So they're not seeing problems. They said of all the rent forbearance requests they got, they dismissed 70% of them because it was big companies trying to take advantage of the system. The smaller companies, the 30% that had requested, they did things. They worked it out on a plan up front where it'll pay off over 6 to 12 months, so it's amortizing out. And they see it, something like single-digit basis points in total revenue. So industrial is very good. And think of that because we shut down the ports. The rail traffic numbers shut down by about 80 or 90%. They're the worst that they ever reported. You look at trucking traffic, it didn't spike like we wanted, but we still kept things moving in and out of our warehouses with other things. It could be PP&E and instead of, video games or something else, GameStop type stuff. So we kept those pretty full. So industrial is a good story. I don't see that changing. In fact, I see it increasing because we're going to do away with just-in-time inventory from the 80s and we're going to add supply stock. So we're going to figure out where do we put all this extra inventory just in case we need it for the next pandemic or crisis. And so I think that's going to go into a lot of potential vacant retail type stuff, to be honest with you. On office, we know from 2009 financial crisis, office leases are generally longer in duration. They're more solid credit companies. Zoom has enabled office using type companies to continue working, whether they're an Equifax doing credit or a bank, Wells Fargo, Bank of America doing banking activity. They're able to do it. Citicorp reported their CEO, 100% of their workforce in the New York region is working remote, but they have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of square feet of office space in New York. They're paying the rent on those things. Equifax calls that redundancy cost. We're going to let people work from home. We're going to subsidize it in some way, but we're going to continue to pay that. It's really going to be 3, 4, 5 years from now when companies say, how did this Zoom experiment work? How'd that remote work? And do we now maybe not renew as many of those leases in those high-rise towers? On the multifamily, we've really had really strong numbers. I'm going to distinguish between workforce and student housing multifamily. Workforce, we're seeing 85, 90, 93% rent collections. Part of that is due to rent forbearance programs and intervention, the PPP programs. So those will all begin to burn off here over the summer and into the fall, and then we need to see what happens after that. But for the most part, if you're going to work at remote or you need a shelter in place, you need a shelter. So people are doing a lot of things. I had one very large multifamily user contact me. They own tens of thousands of units around the country. And they were a little concerned because they said, even with the forbearance programs and the PPP program, that over a third of their tenants paid their rent in May on their credit card, and they didn't understand it. But it goes to show you, in the old days, it was always you pay the mortgage and the rent first, and then the car payment. And then in 2009, it shifted. We pay the car payment first, and we never pay the mortgage. Well, we're back to paying that rent and mortgage first. So workforce, I think, is going to stay strong. I'm very concerned about student housing. We have 136 college towns that play NCAA football, and we don't know if the students are returning to campus in the fall. I have two daughters, one in grad school in Florida and one in undergrad in Alabama. Both of them, when they were returned home, they were worried because they lost their job. They still had a lease that ran through August. So when they brought me home their lease, we looked at it and we found, because of the emergency orders put in place by each governor and the president, state of emergency, it triggered act of God or act of university clauses where we could break the lease the end of March, and we did. So the student housing is going to be a much different story than workforce. So the panic over people not paying rent isn't there yet, but when these intervention programs wind down, I'm a little concerned we could see something change there on the multifamily side.
So it's just a little, I guess, too soon to get a feel for how that's going to work out right now then.
Yeah, so I think the workforce multifamily, especially if you're in a city with a lot of tech workforce or workforce that can work remote, think of Atlanta, financial services, technology, think of the Equifax, think of the banks, think of all the technology companies that can still work remote. I think they'll stay strong. The people still continue to get a paycheck. They're not dependent on a PPP program. So I think in a market like Atlanta, we do really well. I worry more like a market like in Orlando. It's heavy leisure and travel and tourism. I worry about in New York because a lot of folks are giving up on the New York region and the density model and have already left. I have over 100 colleagues that work for JP Morgan, Citigroup, rating agencies, and they've already packed up and left, and they're not coming back. And they've told their employer, I can work Zoom remote anywhere, and they're now in North Carolina or they're in Florida, and they're not coming back. So I worry about, a San Francisco and New York, maybe even in Illinois, but I think a market like Atlanta, we're going to be okay on the multifamily.
For my listeners in New York City, maybe they will come back. And we heard that before after 9/11, right? No one's going to be in a high rise again.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, let me ask you this. I want to ask you about valuations. And you mentioned before that commercial real estate is going to be really should be a strong asset class. Where else you're going to put your money? So, based on the amount of dry powder in the market, the stability of the banks and lenders this time, and the low cap rates that we had and low interest rates we have, what would you assume right now that cap rates would do moving forward? Now, I get it, the value is going to fluctuate on NOI, and some of our properties may have higher expenses, may have higher vacancy. But when you look at cap rates alone, what do you expect moving forward there?
So really good point you bring out here. So most of my last 2 years at the Fed in 2009 and 10 at the New York Fed, I dealt with this grid that had how much you could lose in value from 0 to 40%. And at the top was the change in cap rate. So you went from, say, a 5 to a 7, 25% of the value went away. And NOI, as NOI deteriorated, you could lose another 20, 30% of value. So what we saw in 2009, because it was a liquidity crisis, we saw cap rates move 200 basis points in about 6 quarters between 2008 and mid 2009. We're not going to see that this time. This is not a liquidity crisis. The Fed is keeping leverage low. They're keeping rates low. And they said it's not just something we're going to, get rid of at the end of this year. This could be 1, 2, or 3 years where we see sub 1% interest rates. So I think that leverage ability keeps liquidity pumped in. The Fed is not going to allow the banks to have a redevelopment of huge credit and commercial real estate problems again. So they're going to keep the liquidity in there. If they have to put Fannie Freddie mortgages on their balance sheet, if they have to buy CMBS mortgages, the Fed's going to buy whatever there isn't a price for, and they're going to keep that cap rate very stable. The change is going to come on the NOI side. How do we reprice things? So in office, if now your density ratio goes from 1 employee per 150 to 180 square feet to over 200, as a company, it doesn't have the same value to me. I got to reprice the rent. If I'm in a retail setting and now not just a fire marshal telling me how many people can be in my restaurant or my business, but I have a public health official saying, now you can only have 50 to 70% what the fire marshal says, and I can't generate the same revenue, I reprice what that real estate is worth. So I think the repricing comes on the NOI side, not on the cap rate. We are not going to see big shearing movements. Even on the hotel side, I think the liquidity is there that if they can make a decent cash on cash, they're going to study the NOI. What's the new ADO? What's the average occupancy? What's the new RevPAR? And I think you're going to see that I can't pay $1 million for a hotel room in New York anymore, but maybe I'll pay 400,000 or 500,000 for one. Am I going to pay a $500,000 a room, which somebody did in March in Atlanta and Buckhead? Maybe not. Maybe it goes back to 100 or 200,000 a room. So we're going to see the repricing on NOI, not cap rate.
In KC, you talked about a lot of issues moving down the road with a lot of industries. What is your message to politicians and business leaders as we try to gauge the risk of not working and staying home, and the risk of getting back to business and getting things going?
No, you're exactly right. And so I wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago that's on our Acre website, acre.culverhouse.ua.edu, called "What's Working and Why," and it really looked at why we're going back to work, why are states reopening. So from the health standpoint, we haven't fixed this thing at all. Cases aren't going down. I'll give you a good example. On the April 1st, the total number of global cases of COVID outbreak were under 900,000. Today, there are over 6.8 million. When you look at the individual states, we still have rising cases, we still have hotspots. So the virus hasn't gone away. We don't have vaccines. As we reopen, we're going to commingle largely asymptomatic people. That's the real worry. And a lot of those are women because they have the double X chromosome, so they don't get it as bad as us men. So when they come out and commingle, we have more opportunity for virus transmission. So we haven't solved the public health. We don't have a vaccine. We don't have enough testing. So why in the world are we opening? And it's a simple economic question. So when you look at 100,000 deaths in the United States with 330 million population, we kill almost that many people a year in automobile accidents and other causes. Visual Capitalist has a great graphic on how many people die each day, week, and month in the United States from different things. And the COVID virus is a small little dot on the graphic versus these big bubbles in other areas. So why are we doing it? Well, we don't have an endless pot of money. States only have so much in unemployment insurance trust. In a state like Georgia, where we had a good rainy day fund, we're down to 4 weeks of unemployment insurance benefits. So if we run out, we have to borrow from the federal government. Most states had to do that in 2009 and 10, and it took them as much as 5 years to repay it. So the states are saying, look, we don't have this endless pot of money. We got to get back to work. We've got to figure out how to manage with the virus. We did this with SARS in 2003 and did just fine. We did it with polio for 50 years, where 100,000 kids a year were paralyzed from 1916 to 1956 until we got the Salk polio vaccine. So I think the answer is we're weighing the public health risk against the economic carnage. And you can keep everybody safe, but not have enough funds to feed them and house them and do everything else. And you don't have a good result. So it's really balancing and weighing public health versus economic risk. And that's what's going on. And that's why we're reopening.
Well, the economic carnage, that also causes some health issues as well, right?
It does, and the doctors, even Dr. Fauci, have come out and said, look at whether it's, we all get a simple cabin fever to psychological issues. I can tell you, I have 2 daughters that are 19 and 25, and they're very scarred from this situation and afraid to go out and kind of messed up by it. That it's going to take some work to get them back feeling probably as secure in the world as New Yorkers were on 9/11. It took a long time to get them back to the point wherever they heard a noise, they didn't look up in the sky and see if a plane was hitting. So this is going to have a lasting impact, but I'm in the camp that we can get through it. We can do mitigation. If people act sanely, wear masks or prudent, we can fly, we can travel, we can interact, we can do business again. And just locking the whole place up I don't think is the answer. I'm not in that camp.
Yeah. Well, Casey, what would you leave our audience of commercial real estate participants here in Atlanta and all around the country to think about moving forward related to the economy and commercial real estate?
Yeah, so I started off saying, look up and forward. It's the only way to find light at the end of the tunnel. And granted, even though all lights of the tunnel aren't necessarily fresh air in the outside and they're just another freight train coming down the tracks, at least you'll know to get off the tracks and not get run over and still have a chance to find the real light at the end of the tunnel. The other one is engage in what if thinking. This thing is so fluid that what you think and what you hear today in numbers and assumptions are probably 180 degrees different 30 days later, a week later. Just look at 2 weeks ago. Did any of us really envision the kind of social unrest that we're now experiencing and what kind of impact that's having? That wasn't something that was really in the forecast thing. We could have a vaccine, very, very quickly, and it solved this problem and turned things around. The stock market, I was reading today, this afternoon before I got on, the NASDAQ 100 is within 1% of its all-time high in February. And you're saying, what in the world is the stock market seeing that I'm not? And what they're doing is they're looking forward. And they're making assumptions that say, all right, what's the present value of this disruption for 3 months, 6 months, 12 months? But the fundamentals of these companies are better a year out. So early in my career, I got acquainted with something when I was at Equitable Real Estate called market correction factors. And so I was the young guy, the young MAI that Equitable gave the oil patch markets to, Texas up through Colorado. And there was no demand, there was no leasing. It was as gloom as you could think about it. But the fund owners of those assets said, look, it can't stay that way forever. So why don't we make some assumptions as to how long this goes? Is it 2 years, 3 years? So we'd model that dire situation for 2 or 3 years, and then we would normalize over the next 2 years and have the back end of the cash flow back to a fairly normal state. Well, what that meant is instead of losing 50 to 75% of an asset's value, we only lost 30 to 50%. I think that's what the market's doing. I think as us as professionals, can we look at these assets? Can we think about adaptive reuse? What are we going to do with all of this empty restaurant space or retail space or even hotels that don't fully make it? Can they be affordable housing opportunities? What can we do with them? I'll give you one last great example on this thinking. It just happened this week. Up in Gwinnett County, I-85, going out towards Gwinnett Mall, those that are familiar with Atlanta, there was a failed Dave & Buster's near the Gwinnett Place Mall. There was an entity that's specializing in building up and buying assets to store supply stock that bought it, and they have a client that's looking to put away supply stock like PP&E equipment, and that's what they're going to use the Dave & Buster's for. So they bought it for something less than $50 a square foot that cost $150 a square foot to build originally. So I say look up and forward, do your what if thinking. Whatever assumptions you have today are probably going to be different 30, 60, 90 days from now. And that just get in your mindset that we're going to have a plethora of worst ever economic reports through the summer. Just get past them. And I would say, like, I found so many encouraging nuggets in the first quarter corporate earnings statements across the board, across every industry. Even Marriott and Hilton, even Delta and Southwest Airlines had really encouraging things where they see things going. And so I'd say, when we get later in the summer and we get ready to go through second quarter earnings late this summer, really pay attention to those. I think they're going to tell us a lot more. But, take a couple aspirin and a Tum and maybe a chaser, a beer chaser with the next bad report like Friday, which I think is going to probably show us at a 30% unemployment rate. But that's not going to be 30% a year from now.
Okay. REGA members, stay with us. We're going to have a Q&A after this. KC, Conway, thank you for joining us, sir. Great information as usual.
Thanks, Michael.
All right. And thank you for being with us around the world and around the U.S., listening or watching the show. Thanks for being with us. Let us know what you think about the show. Appreciate you sharing it on your favorite social media. Until next time, be sure you always lead, learn, and laugh. And join us for America's Commercial Real Estate Show. Appreciate the show? Consider referring business or doing business with our sponsors. Bull Realty is a commercial real estate sales, leasing, and advisory firm doing business throughout the Southeast, headquartered in Atlanta. Visit bullrealty.com for more information. Commercial Agent Success Strategies provides video training for commercial agents. This training gets 5-star reviews from even the most experienced brokers. Learn more at commercialagentsuccess.com. You're invited to connect with us on your favorite social media. You can find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. Don't miss a show of special interest to you. Be sure and subscribe to the show on YouTube and Apple Podcasts. And at the show website, creshow.com, you can subscribe for a weekly email announcing the show topic and guest. While you're there, you also found more videos and podcasts. Thank you for watching or listening to America's Commercial Real Estate Show.